I want you to just close your eyes for a second.
Unless you're driving, of course.
Obviously. Unless you're driving or operating heavy machinery, in which case, please keep your eyes strictly on the road. But if you're sitting somewhere safe, just indulge me and imagine this scenario in your mind's eye.
It's a heavy one.
It is. Imagine that since the very first day you were born, since you were a tiny, completely helpless child, you have been chained inside a massive, damp, dark, subterranean cave.
And these aren't just loose chains either.
No, not at all. These chains aren't just loosely wrapped around your wrists or your ankles. They are rigid. They are holding your neck firmly in place. You cannot turn your head, you can't look left, you can't look right, and you certainly cannot look behind you.
Total sensory restriction.
Exactly. All you have ever known, your entire conceptual universe, is the blank, rocky wall directly in front of you. Now, behind you, completely out of your sight, there is a blazing, crackling fire. And between that fire and your back, people are walking along a raised walkway. They're carrying all sorts of objects, wooden statues of animals, carved stone figures, tools, shapes of trees and buildings.
It's a constant parade of shapes.
Yeah, and as they walk, the firelight catches these objects and casts their shadows onto the wall you are staring at. Because you have never, ever seen anything else in your entire existence, you don't even know what a shadow is.
You have no concept of a 3D object casting a 2D projection.
None. You believe with absolute unshakable certainty that those dancing, flickering, two-dimensional shapes on the wall are reality. To you, they are the whole world.
It's an incredibly claustrophobic and terrifying image when you really sit with it. And what's fascinating here is that this isn't just a bizarre thought experiment or a pitch for a dystopian sci-fi movie. This is the foundational metaphor for human consciousness in Western thought.
Exactly. Welcome to this deep dive. Today, our mission is to explore a profound and incredibly detailed set of sources focused on one massive central theme, the path from ignorance to enlightenment.
It's a huge topic.
It is, and we are going to trace the epic, brutal, and ongoing struggle of the human mind to break free from those subterranean chains. We're traveling all the way from the ancient philosophy of Plato in Greece through the radical, explosive ideas of the 18th century Enlightenment.
Down into the severe psychological crises of the modern era.
Right. And finally, we're going to land right back in the digital echo chambers of the 21st century. It is a sweeping journey about how we know what we know, and perhaps more importantly, how we are actively kept from knowing the truth.
To really navigate this vast intellectual landscape without getting lost, we need to look at this material along three main axes.
Let's lay those out for everyone.
First, we are going to examine the philosophical roots of epistemology, which is simply the study of knowledge itself and the liberation of the mind. Tracking is from Plato's ancient insights all the way up to Immanuel Kant's revolutionary definitions of intellectual autonomy.
That's axis one.
Second, we have to look at the psychological and modern crises of reason. As the material points out, particularly through the lens of the Frankfurt School and modern psychology, reason itself can actually become a trap if we aren't incredibly careful.
Which is a terrifying thought.
It really is.
Yeah.
And third, we'll explore how these highly abstract philosophical ideas were put into tangible institutional practice. Specifically, we'll look at the history of liberal Freemasonry.
Using it as a case study, right.
Exactly, using it as a historical case study for how esoteric and rationalist principles were utilized to physically build the secular modern societies we navigate today.
Okay, let's unpack this. I want to go right back into that dark, damp cave we started with. This is, for anyone who hasn't guessed, Plato's Allegory of the Cave from Book 7th of his masterwork, The Republic.
Arguably the most famous metaphor in all of philosophy.
For good reason. But the notes we're working from make a really crucial point right off the bat. We shouldn't just read this as a simple, heartwarming story about getting a good education. It is an incredibly deep ontological and political commentary.
Absolutely.
When we talk about those chains holding the prisoners in place, we have to realize they aren't made of physical iron forged in a blacksmith shop. Those chains are made of habit.
Habit, tradition, societal assumptions.
Exactly. Cultural conditioning. The prisoners are locked in place by their own comfort zones.
That's a vital distinction. And this brings us to a really critical concept highlighted in the text, double ignorance.
Double ignorance. Let's break that down.
You see, the prisoners in the cave don't just lack knowledge. It's not a simple void in their brains waiting to be filled with interesting facts. The ultimate tragedy is that they are entirely unaware that they don't know.
They don't know that they don't know.
Exactly. That is double Ignorance. Ignorance in this philosophical context is not a passive state of just lacking information. It's an active, comfortable, highly institutionalized regime of illusion.
The text mentions a specific Greek term for this, right?
Yes, the Greek term used here is doxa, which translates roughly to common belief or popular opinion.
Right, so for the prisoners, the shadow of a horse isn't a shadow. It is the ultimate, unquestionable reality of a horse. There is no alternative.
Precisely. And Plato takes it a step further. He describes how the prisoners even have contests among themselves. They award honors, status, and prestige to the person who can best predict the movements of the shadows.
Or remember which shadow usually follows another.
Yes. Think about the implications of that. They have built an entire societal structure, a complete hierarchy of prestige and intelligence based entirely on analyzing illusions.
That part always blows my mind. They are literally giving each other awards and patting each other on the back for being the best at analyzing a completely fake reality.
It's absurd, but it's exactly what we do.
And when you think about it, who is carrying the objects in front of the fire? Who are the people making the shadows? The material connects these ancient puppet masters directly to our modern-day reality.
But a very direct line.
Think about today's influencers, the political spin doctors, the corporate PR firms, the media manipulators, and the algorithms. They're the ones walking on that raised platform, projecting shadows onto our screens.
They control the narrative.
Completely. And if you never turn your head, you just accept their projections as the absolute, unquestionable truth.
Which naturally leads to the most difficult question. How do you get out? How do you break those chains of habit? And Plato's answer is deeply unsettling.
It's not a gentle process.
Not at all. The text stresses the concept of paideia, the ancient Greek word for education or upbringing. But true paideia is not about just politely handing a prisoner a book or lecturing them. It is a traumatic, violent, physical process.
Just imagine it. Imagine someone coming into that cave, unlocking your chains, and forcibly dragging you up a steep, jagged, rocky path toward the blinding light of the sun.
It is going to hurt.
A lot. Your eyes, which have only ever known the dim, flickering firelight, are going to be in searing pain. You will feel dizzy, nauseous, and completely terrified. Your instinct will be to desperately turn back to the comforting, familiar shadows.
Because the shadows made sense. They were easy. They were predictable.
Exactly. What Plato is saying is that education, true enlightenment, isn't just loading data into a brain like you're downloading a file to a hard drive. It's a physical and psychological shock.
The sources describe it as a traumatic turning of the entire soul toward the light.
And he has a specific name for that light.
He does. Plato calls this ultimate light the idea of the good, or the agathon. To look at the agathon requires you to realize that everything you previously built your identity around, your awards, your status, your entire understanding of the universe, was a lie.
That is a profound existential crisis. You aren't just learning something new. You are losing your entire world.
It's the complete destruction of the ego's false constructs. But the allegory doesn't end when the prisoner finally gets outside, sees the sun, and understands the true nature of reality.
Right. There's a fatal, deeply tragic final act to this story.
There is. The enlightened individual, now understanding the agathon, feels a profound moral obligation to go back down into the cave to free the others. They can't just stay outside and enjoy the sunshine while their friends are chained in the dark.
It's a duty.
But when they return to that subterranean darkness, their eyes, now accustomed to the brilliant sunlight, cannot adjust. They're temporarily blinded by the dark, they stumble around, they can't see the shadows clearly anymore.
And they certainly can't compete in the shadow-predicting contests.
Exactly.
And the prisoners who are still chained to the wall look at this person who is stumbling around sounding crazy, unable to clearly see the reality on the wall, and they think, wow, going up there ruined them.
They view enlightenment as brain damage.
They do. They mock the enlightened person. They think the outside world is harmful. And here is the darkest part of the allegory, which the sources highlight perfectly. If the enlightened person tries to unchain the others and explain that their entire reality is just shadows on a wall, the prisoners wouldn't just laugh.
No, they would perceive this truth as a violent, existential threat to their existence.
Plato writes that if they could get their hands on the person trying to free them, they would kill them.
It's a direct, chilling nod to Plato's own teacher, Socrates, who was famously executed by the state of Athens for exactly this, for corrupting the youth and questioning the state's accepted realities.
The ultimate price for speaking the truth.
Society instinctively, almost biologically, defends its status quo. The cave does not want to be dismantled. The illusion is protective. And this ancient psychological defense mechanism transitions perfectly into the modern era, where the defense of ignorance hasn't just continued.
It has actually been industrialized. Let's fast forward from ancient Greece to the modern world, because this brings us to one of the most fascinating concepts in our sources, agnotology.
A brilliant term.
This is a term coined by Robert Proctor, a historian of science at Stanford University. Agnotology is the study of culturally induced ignorance or doubt. It asks a terrifying question. What if ignorance isn't just a natural state of affairs? What if it isn't just a lack of knowledge, but a highly refined, deliberately manufactured product?
It forces us to ask how you manufacture ignorance in an age where information is readily available everywhere. The text provides the quintessential historical example, which Proctor himself used to define the entire field of study the tobacco industry in the mid to late 20th century.
Oh, this is a perfect example.
When rigorous scientific evidence began to conclusively show that smoking caused lung cancer, the tobacco industry faced an existential crisis. But they didn't just come out and completely deny the science, because outright, flat denial can be easily disproven by independent scientists. Instead, they manufactured doubt.
Doubt is our product. That was the actual, literal internal memo from a tobacco executive in the 1960s.
It's so sinister.
It is, but as a strategy, it's brilliantly effective.
Yeah.
They realized they didn't need to prove that cigarettes were completely safe. They only needed to create enough confusion so that people would keep smoking.
Right. They would say things like, well, more research is needed, or there are many different scientific views on this complex matter.
They funded their own parallel research institutes just to churn out data that looked incredibly scientific but was entirely designed to muddy the waters.
And if we look closely at the mechanics of this, the sources break down 4 specific tactics used in this agnotological process, the manufacturing of ignorance.
Let's go through those.
The first tactic is suppressing or drowning out true information with sheer noise. You don't necessarily have to ban the truth, which is difficult in a free society. You just flood the zone with so much contradictory information, so many alternative theories, that the truth becomes a needle in a massive haystack of falsehoods.
And the average person simply doesn't have the time, the energy, or the specialized training to sort through it all. So they throw their hands up and give up.
Exactly. That's tactic 1, noise. The second tactic the text outlines is creating a false balance.
This one drives me crazy because you see it in the media all the time.
Oh, constantly.
This is when you treat an established, rigorously verified scientific fact and a completely baseless, fabricated claim as if they are 2 equal sides of a legitimate debate. You put one world-renowned scientist and one internet conspiracy theorist on a split screen, and the host says, well, let's hear both opinions.
It elevates the lie and degrades the truth just by putting them on the exact same platform.
It absolutely weaponizes the concept of fairness to distribute misinformation.
The third tactic is spreading fear and doubt to paralyze decision-making. If people feel like everything is uncertain, if they feel like they can't trust any institution, any data, or any expert, they become paralyzed.
And when humans are paralyzed by uncertainty, they revert to their default habits.
In the case of the tobacco industry, the habit was smoking. In a broader political context, the habit is maintaining the status quo, no matter how damaging it might be.
And that leads right into the fourth tactic detailed in the material, building a culture of obedience and uncritical consumption. If you can degrade a population's critical thinking skills, if you can train them from a young age to just consume sound bites without ever asking why or how, you have created the perfect compliant society.
You've essentially just rebuilt Plato's cave.
But with high-definition screens instead of a campfire. I want you, listening to this right now, to just take a second and think about your daily life. Think about how often you see these exact 4 tactics: noise, false balance, fear-mongering, and the push for uncritical consumption used in your daily news feeds, on social media platforms, or in political campaigns. It is happening all around us, constantly.
What's really crucial to understand is the psychological mechanism that allows these tactics to work so effectively on an individual level. Why are we as human beings so susceptible to manufactured ignorance?
Because we're wired for it, unfortunately.
We are. The sources point us to a well-known phenomenon in modern psychology, the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Psychologists actually have a name for this exact phenomenon, the Dunning-Kruger effect, which explains the illusion of confidence. We've all met someone who knows absolutely nothing about a highly complex topic, let's say macroeconomics or epidemiology, but they speak with the absolute unshakable confidence of a Nobel laureate.
It's baffling to watch.
Why do ignorant people often feel so incredibly confident?
The underlying theory here is that a lack of competence in a given area also deprives the individual of the very cognitive tools necessary to recognize their own incompetence.
Simply put, they don't know enough to know how little they know.
Exactly. The text visualizes this psychological journey as a graph, which is incredibly helpful to map out. Imagine a standard line graph. On the horizontal axis at the bottom, you have your level of actual knowledge or competence, moving from low on the left to high on the right.
Okay.
On the vertical axis going up, you have your level of confidence from low to high.
Okay, so let's walk through this graph because it explains so much of the internet. When you first learn a tiny bit about a new topic, maybe you read one article or, like I mentioned earlier, you watch a 5-minute online documentary about the stock market. Your confidence skyrockets immediately.
You shoot straight up the vertical axis.
The sources call this the Mount of Ignorance, or in the Turkish translation provided in the text, the Cahil Sezareti Tepizi, the Hill of Ignorant Courage. You are at the absolute peak of confidence, but your actual knowledge on the horizontal axis is barely past zero. You think you're ready to beat the market.
This is exactly where the prisoners in Plato's cave are living. They are supremely confident in their knowledge of the shadows.
And this explains perfectly why the prisoners mocked the philosopher who returned from the outside. The philosopher, having seen the vastness and complexity of the real world, is cautious. They know how much they still don't understand.
The prisoners, secure on their Mount of Ignorance, perceive this caution as weakness, confusion, or outright incompetence.
Right, but what happens to you when you actually start to study a subject deeply? As your knowledge increases and you move further along the horizontal axis, you suddenly realize how incredibly vast and complex the topic truly is. You start to see the nuances, the competing theories, the exceptions to the rules, the historical context.
Your confidence absolutely plummets. You fall straight off the Mount of Ignorance and crash down into what the graph calls the Valley of Despair.
The Valley of Despair, that sounds fun.
It's not. You realize you actually know nothing. This is the painful, blinding light of the sun hitting the cave prisoner's eyes. It is the realization of your own massive ignorance. It is deeply, existentially uncomfortable.
It's that moment you realize you're going to lose all your money on the stock market because you actually have no idea how options trading works.
But if you persevere, if you keep studying, keep reading, and keep gaining knowledge despite the discomfort, you begin a slow, gradual climb out of that valley.
And that's called the slope of enlightenment, right?
Yes, the slope of enlightenment.
Mm.
Your confidence slowly builds back up, but it is now a cautious, earned confidence based on actual expertise, not a fragile illusion. But the critical point the sources make, and this connects directly to the Enlightenment philosophy we'll discuss next, is the sheer cost of awakening.
The psychological cost.
Leaving the comfortable heights of the Mount of Ignorance requires immense psychological courage. You have to willingly choose to descend into the Valley of Despair. You have to look in the mirror and admit you were wrong.
And let's be honest, most people don't want to do that. It is so much easier to just pitch a tent on the Mount of Ignorance, find a bunch of other people who also live on the Mount of Ignorance, and stay there forever validating each other.
It's comfortable.
But historically, there was a moment when human society as a whole tried to make that difficult climb. And that brings us to the Enlightenment, the grand intellectual movement of the 17th and 18th centuries. The material zeroes in on an essay written in 1784 by the titan of German philosophy, Immanuel Kant.
A hugely important piece of writing.
The essay is simply titled, "What is Enlightenment?"
Kant's definition in this 1784 essay is a true watershed moment in the history of human thought. He defines enlightenment simply as humanity's emergence from its self-imposed immaturity.
The original German term he uses is Unmündigkeit, right?
Yes, Unmündigkeit, which is translated in the notes as urgent Ohnmama, the state of not being adult, not being of age, or lacking the capacity to speak for oneself.
But wait, let me make sure I'm getting this right, because Kant makes it very clear that this immaturity has absolutely nothing to do with biological age or even a lack of intelligence. A brilliant scientist or a 7-year-old monarch could still be immature by Kant's definition.
Exactly, because this immaturity is moral. It is a choice. Kant argues that people remain in this state of lifelong infancy out of two primary vices, laziness and cowardice.
Laziness and cowardice.
Thinking for yourself is incredibly hard work. It requires energy, rigorous research, and the emotional fortitude to deal with uncertainty and isolation. It is so much easier to let an external authority, be it the state, the church, or just societal norms, hand you a prepackaged set of beliefs.
I have to quote the text here because Kant's irony is just razor sharp. He says, "If I have a book to think for me, a pastor to act as my conscience, and a physician to prescribe my diet, I need not exert myself."
He's mocking the way we outsource our autonomy.
We willingly hand over the keys to our minds to these guardians because it's comfortable. We are complicit in our own subjugation.
And that is exactly why the rallying cry of this entire era, the motto of the Enlightenment that Kant enthusiastically championed, was Sapere Aude.
Sapere Aude.
It's a Latin phrase originally from the Roman poet Horace, and it translates to dare to know, or as Kant interpreted it, have the courage to use your own understanding. Notice he uses the word courage.
It's not just about being smart.
No, it's about being brave. It takes immense guts to question the dogmas that everyone around you accepts as unquestionable reality.
But Kant wasn't an anarchist. He wasn't saying everyone should just rebel against everything all the time because he understood that a functioning society requires order.
Right, he was very practical about that.
And this is where he introduces a rigorous and crucial distinction that the sources highlight the difference between the public and private use of reason. I want to spend some time on this because it sounds a bit counterintuitive to modern ears, but it's foundational.
It is foundational.
Right.
According to Kant, the private use of reason occurs when an individual is acting within a specific civic post or a professional role. For example, a soldier in the military, a clergyman in a church, or a civil servant working for the government.
Okay, so a defined role.
In these specific roles, the individual is acting as a cog in a larger societal machine. Kant argues that in this private sphere, obedience is strictly necessary. A soldier cannot debate the philosophical merits of an order while in the middle of a battlefield. They must obey, or the entire defense system collapses, endangering everyone.
That makes total sense.
A clergyman, while standing at the pulpit acting as an official representative of the church, must teach the accepted doctrines of that church. The rule here is argue as much as you like about whatever you like, but obey.
So, just to be clear for the listener, private in Kant's 18th century context doesn't mean sitting alone in your house writing in a diary. It means acting within your specific restricted professional capacity where you have bound yourself by contract or duty to an institution's rules.
Precisely.
But then there's the public use of reason, and this is where true intellectual freedom lies.
The public use of reason occurs when that exact same individual steps outside their professional role and speaks as a citizen of the world, or as a scholar addressing the entire reading public.
So that same soldier who must absolutely obey orders on the battlefield
Has the right, and Kant would say the duty, to publicly write an essay criticizing these strategic flaws of the military hierarchy.
The clergyman, outside of his official pastoral duties, has the right to publicly publish a theological treatise questioning the very dogmas of his church.
Exactly.
Think about how wild that is for the 1700s. Kant is essentially inventing the modern whistleblower concept, or at least the framework for academic freedom right here. He's saying your boss or the state or the church owns your actions while you are on the clock performing your duty, but they absolutely do not own your mind.
And the sources reference the 20th century philosopher Jürgen Habermas here, noting that this specific Kantian distinction laid the theoretical groundwork for what we now call the public sphere.
The public sphere.
It's the foundational concept for modern liberal democracies. It created intellectual spaces, salons, journals, coffee houses, where the strict hierarchies of the feudal and religious world were stripped away. A duke and a merchant could meet as equals in the public sphere to debate ideas solely on the merit of human reason, not on their social rank.
What's really fascinating, though, is how this intellectual framework manifested very differently depending on where you were in Europe. While Kant was sitting in Prussia writing highly structured, disciplined philosophical treatises about duty and reason,
Across the border in France, the Enlightenment was taking on a very, very different flavor.
it was much more visceral, it was deeply political, incredibly subversive, and fiercely anti-clerical.
Yes, the French Enlightenment was less of a quiet academic debate and more of an intellectual street fight. The text points us to Denis Diderot and Jean-Laurent d'Alembert, the masterminds behind the famous encyclopedia.
Now, obviously, we all know what an encyclopedia is, but the context here is crucial. We can't think of Diderot's project like a dusty set of reference texts sitting in a middle school library. The material explains that in 18th century France, Diderot's encyclopedia was literally designed and executed as a war machine against the old regime.
The stated goal of Diderot's project was to change the common way of thinking. To understand why a book was so revolutionary, you have to understand how knowledge was structured before it.
It was a pyramid, right?
Exactly. In the medieval and early modern worldview, knowledge was strictly hierarchical. Theology and the study of the divine were at the very top, reigning supreme. Below that was philosophy, then the sciences, and down at the very bottom were the mechanical arts, the trades, the dirty work of peasants and artisans.
And Diderot just flipped the table.
Diderot and D'Alembert shattered this entire pyramid simply by organizing the encyclopedia alphabetically.
The alphabetical subversion. It is such a brilliant, seemingly innocent tactic. By simply going from A to Z, they took the concept of God and put it on the exact same structural footing as commerce or agriculture or carpentry.
It completely flattened the universe.
It suggested to the reader that understanding how to build a good plow or weave silk was just as valuable, just as worthy of human documentation and study as elite theological debates about the nature of the soul.
And they went much further than just alphabetical flattening. Knowing that the state and church censors were watching their every move, and in fact the project was repeatedly banned and Diderot was imprisoned, they bypassed censorship using a highly sophisticated system of cross-references.
It was essentially an intellectual Trojan horse.
It was.
The sources share this amazing anecdote about how they pulled this off, and it's brilliant. You would be reading an entirely straightforward, seemingly objective entry on cannibalism, a detached anthropological description of ancient tribes eating human flesh.
Yeah.
The censors would read it and think, fine, nothing heretical here. But at the very bottom of the entry, the cross-reference wouldn't point to other tribal customs. It would say, see also Eucharist.
They were directly linking the sacred Christian ritual of communion, eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ, to the anthropological concept of savage cannibalism.
It was a devastating, subtle critique hidden in plain sight. They were teaching the reader to associate religious dogma with primitive superstition without ever explicitly saying it, thereby evading the censors.
It was intellectual guerrilla warfare. And this combative, fearless spirit was embodied most fiercely by the most famous voice of the French Enlightenment, Voltaire.
The text introduces Voltaire's famous war cry, which he used to sign off his letters "Écrasez l'infâme," which translates to crush the loathsome thing, or crush the infamous.
We need to be precise here, as the sources clarified a common misconception about Voltaire. When Voltaire said crush the loathsome thing, he was not launching an attack on an individual's personal spiritual faith in a higher power.
No, he was a deist himself.
Right. He wasn't telling everyday peasants they couldn't pray for comfort. The target of his rage, the infamous thing, was the institutionalized, fanatical, and oppressive political structure of the Catholic Church at the time.
He was attacking a massive, wealthy system that used state power, intense censorship, torture, and violence to enforce dogma and crush any intellectual dissent. Voltaire viewed this institutional power as the ultimate enemy of human progress and reason.
And his entire life's work was dedicated to dismantling it through satire, philosophy, and relentless public advocacy for civil liberties.
And this ties directly into the institutional history we are tracking in this deep dive. You mentioned earlier that ideas need organizations to actually change society. In 1778, shortly before his death, Voltaire was initiated into the Parisian Masonic Lodge of the Nine Sisters.
A hugely symbolic moment.
And Benjamin Franklin was actually there. Franklin, who was the American ambassador to France at the time and a prominent Freemason himself, helped guide Voltaire into the lodge. The text frames this specific event as the ultimate historical symbol of the alliance between Enlightenment philosophy and the institution of Freemasonry.
It represents the moment when the abstract ideals of reason, liberty, and equality found a physical, organized, and highly secretive home to operate from.
It's a triumphant narrative, this upward march of reason conquering darkness. But before we get completely swept up in that, the sources force us to hit the brakes hard.
We really have to.
We have to pause the story of progress and look at the profound crisis that occurred in the 20th century, because the terrifying question arises. What happens if reason itself goes wrong?
Yeah, this is the dark side of the narrative, and it's a tough pivot. We just spent all this time celebrating the triumph of the mind over dogma, but the sources bring in a devastating critique from the Frankfurt School.
Specifically, we're looking at a text published in 1944 called Dialectic of Enlightenment by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer.
They were writing this while the unimaginable horrors of World War II and the Holocaust were actively unfolding around them. They looked at the world, a world supposedly built on the scientific revolution and Enlightenment ideals, and asked a haunting question. If the Enlightenment was supposed to free us from barbarism, why is humanity sinking into a new, even more efficient kind of barbarism?
Adorno and Horkheimer argued that the Enlightenment carried a fatal flaw within its very DNA. They proposed that the original underlying driver of the Enlightenment wasn't actually a noble, pure quest for truth or human betterment.
It was driven by fear.
Fear, specifically a primal, ancient fear of the unknown, a fear of the chaotic, unpredictable forces of nature. Early humans felt completely helpless against storms, disease, famine, and the dark. The Enlightenment, they argued, was at its core a desperate attempt to master nature, to control it, to strip away its terrifying mystery so that humans could finally feel safe.
But here's where the trap springs. In their desperate attempt to control nature, Adorno and Horkheimer argue that humanity changed the very definition of reason. Reason morphed from being a philosophical tool used to discover meaning, ethics, and human values into what they called instrumental reason.
Let me try to break that down. Instrumental reason doesn't care about the why. It doesn't ask if what we are doing is morally right or just. It only cares about how to do things efficiently. It is a cold, calculating, classifying mechanism.
If a process is highly efficient and useful for achieving a goal, instrumental reason says it is good.
But if something can't be measured, quantified, or put into a spreadsheet, things like human dignity, empathy, or spiritual value, instrumental reason dismisses it as an irrelevant illusion.
And this leads directly to what the sources describe as the horror of positivism.
Yeah.
Just to ground that term for our listeners, positivism is essentially the belief that if you can't measure it, quantify it, or prove it scientifically, it doesn't exist or simply doesn't matter.
The Enlightenment tried to free us from religious myth, but it ended up creating a new, equally dangerous myth, the myth of absolute, infallible, cold calculation.
And the text makes an incredibly solemn, terrifying historical assertion here. It argues that the Holocaust, the industrial-scale slaughter at Auschwitz, was not an abandonment of reason. It was not a reversion to unthinking, passionate animal savagery. Rather, it was the terrifying, logical triumph of cold, bureaucratic, valueless, instrumental reason.
That is a chilling thought to sit with. The death camps weren't chaos. They were run on strict train schedules, meticulously calculated logistics, and punch cards tracking human beings as mere inventory. It was a system that looked at a human being and only saw a measurable unit of labor, calories to be extracted, or a disposable resource to be eliminated efficiently.
It was reason completely stripped of its soul.
And the text notes that this stands as an eternal, blaring warning for any Enlightenment institution, government, or philosophy. Light without empathy, without ethics, and without conscience ceases to be illuminating. It becomes a blinding, burning radiation that destroys whatever it touches.
A purely rational system that lacks a moral compass can justify absolute atrocities simply because they are mathematically efficient.
Which forces us to ask another deeply unsettling question, this one brought up by the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm. I want to ask you, the listener, a question that sounds absurd on its face. Do we actually want to be free?
It's a provocative question.
We talk about freedom like it's the ultimate human desire, the end goal of all politics, but is it?
Fromm explores this paradox in his seminal 1941 psychological analysis, Escape from Freedom. To understand modern anxiety, Fromm asks us to look back at the Middle Ages. In the feudal system, people were absolutely not free. You were born a serf, you died a serf, you belonged to a guild, you belonged to a lord, you belonged body and soul to the church.
But Fromm points out a crucial psychological reality. Within those strict, oppressive chains, there was immense psychological security. You knew exactly who you were, what your role was, and exactly where you fit in the cosmic and social order. You had guaranteed roles and a guaranteed community. You were never alone.
Then the Enlightenment and the rise of modern capitalism come along and swing a giant sword, severing all those ancient ties. Suddenly, you are no longer defined by your lord or your guild. You are a free, autonomous individual.
You can move to the city, you can be whatever you want.
But Fromm argues that this sudden liberation left modern humans feeling deeply isolated, alienated, and incredibly anxious. Think about the modern gig worker. You are completely free to set your own hours, but you are entirely alone, unsupported, and terrifyingly vulnerable to the market.
You are free, but you are alone in a vast, cold universe. The burden of creating your own identity from scratch is terrifying.
And because that existential terror, that profound isolation, is psychologically unbearable for many people, from outlines three primary mechanisms people use to try to escape this new, terrifying freedom.
The first escape mechanism is authoritarianism. This is the psychological root of fascism, which Fromm was analyzing as it rose in Europe. The isolated, frightened individual seeks to submit themselves entirely to a powerful, totalitarian leader or a rigid state structure.
By giving up their freedom and merging their identity with a massive, seemingly invincible power, they temporarily relieve their anxiety. They feel powerful by association.
The second escape mechanism Fromm identifies is destructiveness. If the external world makes you feel completely powerless, insignificant, and threatened, the psychological response is to try and destroy that world before it can destroy you.
You eliminate the threat by eliminating the world outside yourself. It's a dark, violent reaction to powerlessness.
And the third mechanism, which is arguably the most pervasive in modern democratic consumer societies, is what Fromm calls automaton conformity. Instead of submitting to a dictator, the individual submits to the crowd.
They melt into mass culture. They adopt the opinions, the fashions, the political views, and the desires of the majority so completely that they become exactly like everyone else.
By erasing their unique individuality, they avoid the heavy burden of individual selfhood. The fear of sticking out, the fear of isolation, drives them back into a self-imposed cave of conformity.
So we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. The chains of the Middle Ages were oppressive, but modern freedom is terrifying and isolating. What is Fromm's solution? How do we live as free individuals without losing our minds?
Fromm counters these escapes with his concept of positive freedom. Positive freedom is the ability to connect with the world and other people through genuine love, spontaneous creation, and meaningful work, while still retaining your unique individuality.
You bridge the gap, not by conforming, but by connecting. And this brings us right back to the institutional text we're analyzing. The sources note that the Masonic principle of brotherhood aims to provide this exact psychological bridge.
It attempts to create a sense of belonging and tight-knit community that cures the isolation of modern life. But it attempts to do so without demanding the automaton conformity that crushes individuality.
This transitions us perfectly into understanding how these institutions actually operate on a practical level.
Yeah.
How do you take these incredibly abstract philosophies, Kant's autonomy from Prohast's positive freedom, Diderot's subversion, and turn them into a daily practice?
The text delves deeply into the world of Freemasonry, describing it as an esoteric pedagogy. It's a system of teaching that blends the intellectual rigor of Enlightenment rationalism with the highly symbolic, inward-looking traditions of Renaissance humanism.
So let's talk about the rituals. Let's talk about the symbols. Because it's one thing to sit and read a dense book about reason. It's another thing entirely to act it out in a room with others.
The sources break down the core metaphor of this entire system, the ashlar, or the building stone.
In Masonic symbolism, the individual human being is represented by a stone. When a person first approaches the institution, coming from the profane or everyday world, they are considered a rough ashlar.
This is a stone exactly as it was violently pulled from the quarry, covered in rough edges, uneven, unrefined, completely unsuitable for building.
These rough edges symbolize a person's ignorance, their prejudices, their unchecked passions, and their unexamined dogmatic beliefs. Now, it's crucial to note here that the rough ashlar isn't considered bad or evil. It is simply raw potential that lacks form and purpose.
To change that, to realize that potential, the individual has to use metaphorical tools. They use the gavel, which symbolizes willpower and discipline, and the chisel, which symbolizes reason, education, and analytical thought.
By repeatedly striking the chisel with the gavel, applying sheer will to reason, the individual painstakingly chips away at their own flaws. The goal is to transform from that rough rock into a perfect or cubical ashlar.
A stone with straight, true edges, perfectly balanced and refined. It represents the enlightened, ethical, self-controlled human being.
But there is a critical point from the text that we must emphasize. This entire process is not just an exercise in narcissistic self-improvement. You don't polish the stone just to put it on a pedestal in your house and admire your own virtue.
The perfectly carved cubical stone has a specific architectural purpose. It is designed to fit seamlessly alongside other perfect stones into the metaphorical temple of humanity. The refinement of the individual is entirely oriented toward a social utility.
You better yourself so that you can be a strong, reliable building block for a better, more just society.
It's applied philosophy. You fix yourself to fix the world. And I want to get into my favorite part of the symbolic journey detailed in the text. Because before you can build the temple, before you even pick up the chisel, you have to look inward.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where the psychological depth of the ritual really shines. The text describes the initial phase of initiation, known as the chamber of reflection. Before a candidate is brought into the light of the lodge to join the community, they are placed completely alone in a dark, isolated tomb-like room.
It is a visceral, physical recreation of descending into the earth or returning to the darkness of Plato's cave, but this time it is intentional. Inside this dim room, usually lit only by a candle, they are surrounded by stark symbols of mortality, a human skull, an hourglass, and alchemical elements like salt and sulfur.
It sounds incredibly intense, almost frightening. And on the wall of this dark room, there is a famous acronym painted VITRIOL.
The text provides the Latin translation, Visita interiora terra rectificando in venies occultum lapidem. In English, this translates to, visit the interior of the earth, and by rectifying yourself, you will find the hidden stone.
The profound psychological lesson here is that enlightenment is not a commodity you can purchase from an external authority. A master cannot simply hand you the truth. The darkness of that chamber represents the womb of light. Before you can face the external world and its problems, you must first have the courage to face your own internal cave.
You must sit in the dark and confront your own inevitable mortality, your deepest fears, your ego, and your subconscious biases. Only by rectifying or correcting your inner self can you find the hidden, true foundation of your character, that hidden stone.
And once you emerge from that internal darkness, the sources detail the subsequent symbolic trials of the elements. The candidate, usually blindfolded to represent their initial ignorance, goes through a physical journey around the lodge room that simulates the chaos of life.
There is the trial of error, representing the dogmatic noise, the storms of misinformation, and the confusion of the world we talked about with agnotology.
There is a trial of water, symbolizing the floods of human passion, anger, and emotion that can overwhelm our reason.
And finally, the trial of fire, representing the purifying, illuminating power of reason itself that burns away the last remnants of illusion.
This intense, almost militant focus on reason and absolute freedom of thought eventually led to a massive historical earthquake within the institution itself. Moving our timeline forward to the 19th century, the text focuses specifically on the Grand Orient of France, or the GODF.
To understand this monumental schism, we have to look at the rules of the time. Until 1877, mainstream Freemasonry around the world, largely governed by the ancient traditions of the United Grand Lodge of England, required all its members to explicitly profess a belief in a supreme being and the immortality of the soul. It was a strict, non-negotiable requirement for entry.
But the 19th century in France was a boiling pot. You had explosive scientific discoveries, the rise of positivism, and an intense, ongoing political struggle against the overwhelming power of the Catholic Church. The requirement to swear a belief in God was starting to feel, to many French thinkers, like a lingering chain from the old dogmatic world they were trying to escape.
And the sources introduce us to a truly fascinating historical figure in this debate, Frederick Desmond.
Frederick Desmond is a remarkable historical paradox. He was an ordained Protestant pastor and a prominent member of the French Senate. Yet in 1877, it was this deeply religious man who stood before...
And when it came to a vote, the proposal actually passed, 135 to 76. They literally voted to remove the mandatory belief in God.
The fallout was immediate and massive. The English Masonry and many other Grand Lodges worldwide declared this move irreligious, irregular, and immediately severed all official ties with the French organization. This historic split gave birth to what is now known as Liberal Freemasonry, or a dogmatic Freemasonry.
By removing the theological requirement, Liberal Freemasonry aimed to create a completely neutral space, a true physical realization of Kant's public sphere where men of all faiths, and no faith at all, could debate religion, politics, science, and societal inequality without any preconceived dogmatic boundaries. They were aiming for Kant's full, unadulterated exit from immaturity.
And what's crucial is that they didn't just stay in their private lodges debating philosophy and polishing stones. They took these ideas out into the streets and directly into the halls of government.
The sources detail how liberal Freemasonry became deeply, inextricably intertwined with the politics of the French Third Republic, which lasted from 1870 to 1940. This era is sometimes even referred to by historians as the Republic of Freemasons due to how many cabinet members were initiates.
Their primary political target, breaking the massive centuries-old hegemony that the Catholic Church held over the French education system and political life. They wanted to build a truly secular architecture for modern society.
The absolute climax of this generational political fight is highlighted in the 1905 law on the separation of the churches and the state. This monumental piece of legislation was heavily driven by prominent liberal Masons in the government, such as Aristide Briand and Emile Combes.
The 1905 law was revolutionary for its time. It officially declared absolute state neutrality in all matters of religion. It completely stopped all state funding and subsidies for the clergy. It guaranteed the freedom of worship, but it strictly pushed religion out of the public square and into the private sphere.
Ironically, this mirrors Kant's categories but applies them to state institutions. Religion was no longer allowed to dictate public law or be taught in public schools.
It was a massive, historic victory for secularism. It laid the foundation for modern France. But as we follow the sources, we have to look at the entire historical record, including the incredibly dark spots.
The fight for secularism wasn't always a clean, noble philosophical debate fought with essays and speeches. The text details a major, devastating political scandal from 1904 known as the Affair of the Cards, or in the Turkish sources, the Fişleme Skandalı.
To analyze this objectively based on the text, the Affair of the Cards revealed a massive intelligence operation. It was uncovered that the Grand Orient de France was actively and secretly collaborating with the French War Ministry. They were using their vast network of lodges across the country to secretly profile military officers.
If an officer was known to be a devout Catholic, if they went to Mass, or if they were suspected of having conservative or monarchist sympathies, the local lodges would create a secret philo card on them.
They would send this card directly to the Ministry of War to ensure that the officer's career advancement and promotions were permanently blocked.
They were spying on their own citizens, profiling them based on their private religious beliefs and politics to ruin their careers. It's an incredibly stark, tragic paradox. Here you have an Enlightenment institution born out of a desire for absolute freedom of conscience, a group that literally voted to remove dogma, resorting to the exact same oppressive shadow tactics they claimed to be fighting against.
They used the secretive tools of the Inquisition in the name of freedom. The sources note that this scandal severely damaged their reputation and nearly brought down the government. It is a potent historical reminder of what we discussed earlier with Adorno and Horkheimer.
When you become absolutely convinced that you possess the ultimate rational truth, the temptation to force it on others, to crush your opponents by any means necessary, is immense. You fight dogma with dogmatic tactics, and you corrupt your original mission.
It proves mathematically that the rough ashlar is never fully smoothed. Human nature is frail. The potential for reverting to the darkness of the cave, to the comfort of authoritarian control, is always present, even and perhaps especially among those who claim to carry the light. And this ongoing precarious struggle brings us out of the history books and directly into the present day.
Yes, the 21st century. As we wrap up this deep dive, we have to apply all of this to our current reality. The sources argue compellingly that the cave Plato described thousands of years ago hasn't disappeared. It has just been radically upgraded.
The cave is now digital.
The shadows dancing on the wall are no longer carved wooden animals carried by people in front of a fire. They are deep fakes, highly sophisticated fake news, bot farms, and post-truth narratives. And who is projecting them? The algorithms, the massive, opaque algorithms that carefully curate our personalized echo chambers, feeding us only the information that confirms our pre-existing biases and keeps us infinitely scrolling.
The new frontier of this ancient philosophical struggle is technological. The text points out that modern liberal Freemasonry, keeping with its tradition of anticipating societal shifts, has moved much of its philosophical focus toward the existential questions posed by artificial intelligence and transhumanism.
The grand question they're debating now is, what happens to the rough ashlar, the flawed biological human being, when humanity attempts to transition into Homo Deus, when we become technologically enhanced entities, potentially merging our consciousness with machines to overcome biology entirely?
It's the ultimate test of the entire Enlightenment project. If we can alter our own biology, if artificial intelligence can process information and make decisions for us a million times faster than we can think for ourselves, do we lose our human autonomy entirely? Do we just hand over Kant's courage to know to a server farm owned by a tech monopoly?
The ultimate risk identified in the sources is profound and imminent. Technology, if left solely to the raw, unchecked forces of the market and cold instrumental reason, is incredibly dangerous. The warning from the text is that this rapidly advancing technology must be strictly regulated by what they call Republican values and fundamentally anchored in the concept of human dignity.
If we fail to proactively instill these ethical frameworks into our code, then instead of AI and transhumanism liberating us from the final constraints of nature, they will simply construct a new, inescapable, and terrifying form of slavery and domination. The chains won't be made of habit or tradition, they will be made of unbreakable code.
So, what does this all mean? We have covered a truly massive amount of ground today. If we synthesize the diverse sources we've explored, the core takeaway is that the path from ignorance to enlightenment is not a straight upward line of inevitable progress. It is a dialectic. It is a messy, painful, never-ending journey characterized by constant push and pull.
It started with the shocking realization of the chains in Plato's ancient cave. It found a demanding voice in constant insistence that we have the courage to use our own minds. It was institutionalized in the symbolic, painstaking chiseling of the Masonic ashlar, striving to build a better society. And now it faces its greatest, most insidious challenge in the digital algorithms that threaten to put us comfortably back to sleep all over again.
I would conclude that the texts show us true enlightenment is, above all, a precarious balancing act. On one hand, we must fiercely reject the absolute unquestioning obedience demanded by dogmatic religion, superstition, and authoritarian regimes.
But on the other hand, as Adorno and Horkheimer so chillingly warned, we must equally reject the soulless, cold, calculating rationalism of pure positivism that views human beings as mere data points to be optimized. The perfect stone, the flawless human being, the utopian society, none of these actually exist in reality. As the sources beautifully remind us, only the effort to perfect them exists. The Enlightenment is not a final destination you arrive at. It is the continuous, courageous act of walking toward the light, day after day.
It's the effort that defines us. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, building on the warnings from our sources about the digital age we are living in right now. If the Enlightenment taught us that it is our own laziness and cowardice that keep us chained in the cave, we have to look very, very closely at the glowing rectangles in our pockets today. We have willingly, even enthusiastically, built digital echo chambers that do our thinking for us, that instantly validate our biases, and that efficiently filter out any uncomfortable truths that might cause us the pain of growth. We have to ask ourselves, are we truly the helpless prisoners of these algorithms, or did we willingly hand over the chains because the personalized, high-definition shadows dancing on our screens are just too comfortable, too entertaining to ever look away from? Have the courage to know. Until next time, keep diving deep.